Hello and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be doing problem number 2694, event emitter in JavaScript. In this problem, you want to design an event emitter class, and it is similar to the one found in Node.js or the event target interface of the DOM, where you can subscribe to events and emit them. Just like if you click on a button, you can have it do multiple things. This is essentially what this is. So our event emitter class should take the following two arguments: the name of the event as a string and a callback function. The callback function will be called when the event is emitted, and event should be able to have multiple listeners for the same event, so that's important. When emitting an event with multiple callbacks, each should be called in the order that they were subscribed. An array of results should be returned. You can assume no callbacks past the subscribes are referentially identical. And the subscribe method should have an object with an unsubscribe method that enables them to unsubscribe. So then when it is called, the callback should be removed. And essentially, we have another emit. Also, it takes two arguments. The name of the event is a string, and an optional array of arguments that will be passed to callback. If there's no callbacks, then return empty array. Okay, so we're not going to go through the examples, but we're going to go more through like what it's supposed to be doing. All right. So we have a subscribe, right? So you have subscribe. And essentially what this does is you give it a callback, and what's going to happen is we need to add that callback to the callbacks for the event, and then we also need to return an object that can let us unsubscribe. So essentially it's going to look like let's go through some, like a simple example. Let's say we have some events. So right now we're going to start with no events and no callbacks. And let's say we do a subscribe, and we do a subscribe to a function called plus, right? At event, and we'll just have like on click and maybe like on key press or something. So subscribe to an action called plus, and the event will be on click, right? So then what we should have here is we need to have the event. So what's the event? It's going to be on click, so let's just call that click. And the event is going to be, or the callback is going to be a plus, right? And a subscribe should add this, like we're going to have this variable in our actual event emitter, and we're going to subscribe, and then we need to return an object that lets us unsubscribe, right? So we need to just return some kind of object, just call that obj, that lets us unsubscribe in some way. We don't really know how yet, right? And then we can do another subscribe. Let's say we want to subscribe to like maybe minus, also on click, so we would add minus here, right? And then maybe we want to have like on key press, so let's call that press. And we want to have some more functions that we want to subscribe to. So for the minus, this object should be the plus object that can let us unsubscribe. Then we have an object that lets us unsubscribe from minus. And then if we have something like, let's say key press, we have another function called like multiply maybe. So let's add that in there. And then we have another object that lets us unsubscribe from there. Let's just call that multiply for now. We're going to go into the implementation later. Okay. And so now what's going to happen is for the emit, what we're going to get is we're going to get an event and arguments. And then if the event is in there, then we need to go through all of these things. Otherwise, we need to be doing nothing, right? So let's say we call emit on an event like jump or something, right? Then that event is not in here. We only have a click and a press. So if we call an event that's not in there, we don't need to do anything. But if we call event emit on, let's say, click with some arguments, then we need to go through all of these functions in click, and we need to call them on arguments, and we need to return. So the nice thing is, as the way I drew this out, you can actually have a hash map or a set or something of events. So essentially what you can do is you can actually have a hash map here, which is in JavaScript just an object. And then you can just check anytime you subscribe to an event, just say like, is my event in here already, right? So let's say I subscribe to a click event. If it is in there, then just add the callback into the array. And if it's not in there, let's create a new event, right? Like, let's say we make a new event called jump. We can just add that event in there. And then we can either store this as like an array or a set or whatever. We're going to store it as a set, actually. So these, instead of arrays, these will be set. So we can just create a new set every time we get a new event, and we can just add the callback there. And then when we emit, we can just check like, okay, is that event in our object? If it is, let's just go through the callbacks in the set. Otherwise, let's do nothing, right? Because there are no callbacks in the set. So now the only tricky thing is the unsubscribe, right? Like the subscribe is pretty straightforward. We're just going to add the event into the object that's in the class. We're going to add the callbacks into the set for the event, and we're going to keep adding. But how do we actually unsubscribe? So unsubscribe actually needs to have access to, what does it need to have access to? It needs to have access to, so let's write unsubscribe here somewhere. Okay, let's just say unsubscribe is down here, unsub maybe. Okay, so unsub, let's just say, you know, how do we have access to, what do we need access to? We need access to a couple things, right? We need access to the event, and we need access to the callback. And we need access to this object over here, right? So it turns out you can actually have really easy access to these things. And let's say you do have access to these, then it's pretty straightforward, right? If we have access to the event and the callback and this object, then we can just say, all right, let's just look in this object for the event. Let's say we have jump. Let's look in the set for the callback, and let's remove it, right? So that's how you would unsubscribe in these objects. So if these objects somehow have access to the event, the callback, and the unsubscribe, then the event, the callback, and the object, then we can just remove them from the object. Pretty straightforward, right? We just have a key, which is the event. The callback is going to be in the set. We can just say set.remove or set.delete or whatever it is in JavaScript. But the question is, how do we actually have access to these things? Like when we return this object, how do we have access to this and the event and the callback? So I'm actually going to show you something that's kind of interesting that I found out today that's going to make this a lot easier. So here we have a simplified version of the event emitter. It doesn't actually do much. We just have a constructor, and in the constructor we have a this dot blah 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 equals hello world. We have a subscribe, and subscribe is going to be similar to our event emitter, only it's not really going to do anything. It's more just to test like what we can do. And so actually what's going to happen here is, what are we doing in the subscribe? We are returning, we're returning an object with an unsubscribe property, just like we're going to have, right? Just like we're going to be doing in the actual event emitter. And now we're saying console log this dot blah blah blah. And so notice, first of all, so if you return an object or a function in another function, that function has access to anything that subscribe has access to. So subscribe has like an event and a callback here. Then this object has access to this event and this callback because it's a closure. So that's going to be taken care of, right? So we want the event and the callback we want the event and the callback. That's going to be taken care of, because if we call subscribe with an event and a callback, this object will have access to them directly in a closure. But in a class, there's another special thing that I didn't know, and so I figured that out today, is because in a class, everything with a this keyword is going to be accessible through every method in the class, right? Like in Python the same way. If you do self.whatever in your constructor, all your other methods will have access to it. And so when you return an object or a function in another function as a closure, not only do you have access to all of these fields, you know, this A, B, C, and then if you make something else like D equals something, you have access to D as well. Not only do you have access to these, but you actually have access to every single variable that's declared with a this keyword, because subscribe has access to these variables. So if I make a bunch of variables here, like this dot blah blah blah, this dot a bunch of whatever you want, whenever we return this object, it will have access to all of them. And keep in mind that, so if we have integers here, like if this is integer A, B, C, then they are passed by value, right? So this object will have access to A, B, C, but it will have access to a unique version of them. But because objects or functions, or, you know, like, so objects are passed by reference. If we actually make an object here, and then we access this object will be passed by reference. So if we modify it here, it will also be modified in here. So actually, if we make, so let's actually, print this and see what happens. So if we run this, you can see that it actually prints hello world. Even though we never defined hello world in this unsubscribe, because the subscribe has access to this dot blah blah blah, which is hello world, we have access to this dot blah 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 as well. So that's like another part of a closure in a class that works in JavaScript that is not super intuitive, I'd say, but that's just something to know. So whenever you return an object or a function in a class, you're going to have access to all of these keywords because you have access to all of these in whatever method you make them in. Okay, so now that we know that, we're going to actually have access to this object here. If we define it with this keyword in the emitter, we just have access to it directly because it's a closure. So now that we have access to the event, the callback, and the object, it's pretty straightforward. All we have to do is just look for the key with the event, and we just delete the callback. Pretty straightforward way to do that. Okay, so now we have enough to start coding. So let's do that. Let's actually reset our code here. Now that I explained what I wanted to. Okay, so we're actually going to make a constructor like I talked about, and we're actually going to have this keyword. So we're going to make a constructor here. And we're going to say this dot events is an object. And this is going to be the object that's going to have all of the events and the callbacks associated with them. So now what do we need to do inside the subscribe, like I talked about here, right? So if there is no event in the object, we need to put it in, right? And we're just going to put it in. We're just going to make a new set. So we can say something like if not this events has own. You can do this in a bunch of different ways. Property event. If this doesn't exist, then let's actually add it in. So this event. And like I said, we're going to use a set because that will allow us to quickly see if a callback is in the events, right? So this events, if you used an array, like you'd have to use like includes to figure out if it was in the array. So that would be big O of n time. So you'd rather just use a set because that's big O of 1. Okay. So we're going to make a set here. And now we're going to finally add the callback. And if it's already in there, it's a set, right? So we don't have to worry about that. We don't have to worry about like if it's in there already. So you can actually add functions to a set, which is kind of nice as well. Okay, so we're going to add that in. Now in the unsubscribe, what do we need to do? Well, we need to remove the callback from the set, right? So we can say this, and remember we have access to this events in this unsubscribe, like I talked about earlier, because this is a closure. So we have access to it, and the only way we wouldn't is if we redefine some other events. Like if we said events is something in here, then that would override this events, and then we wouldn't have access to it. So we could say this event. We also have access to event and the callback, right? Because a closure made in subscribe. So we have access to this, we have access to this, and we have access to this. Okay. So what do we need to do? This events delete, and this is just like remove in Python. We need to remove the callback, and then we can also check if this set is empty. We can just delete the whole key from the hash table, right? Or the object, I guess. So events, and the way to do this in JavaScript is for a set, the way to check the size is you have to use size instead of length. So you can say if it's like this, then let's just delete it. Okay. This should be event. So let's go over this one more time. So essentially we're saying we have some event, right, that we want to unsubscribe from, and we have access to it. So let's just say, let's go to this object, let's use the key event, and let's delete the callback in the set of these. So this would be like, if we wanted to delete the minus in the click, we'd say, okay, let's go to the click keyword. It's over here. Here's our set, and let's delete this minus. And then finally, let's check if our set is empty, then let's just delete this whole key value pair. Okay. So now finally we have the emit. And so what do we need to do in the emit? So we can just have an output array, right? We can just have result, and we can say the same kind of thing. So we can copy this a little bit. This should be event. Okay. So we can just say if this event does not have this property of event, right? So if our event object doesn't actually have this event, then there are no callbacks. So we can just return the result straight away. Otherwise, we can take the callbacks we have. So we can just say callbacks equals this dot event, or this is events event. This is going to be the set of callbacks that are in here. And let's just go through them one by one and execute them on the argument. So we can say for constant. So if you're iterating through a set, you actually need to use of as opposed to in. So you can just say for a constant function of callbacks, let's just res.push function, right? So this is all the functions for that particular event. Let's just call function on the argument. So the arguments is going to be an array. It might be 0 arguments, but we actually need to use a spread operator to spread out the array into arguments, right? So if we have an array of like 1, 2, 3, we need to call function on like 1, 2, 3, and we can use the spread operator to do that. Okay. Now finally we pushed everything. We called all the functions on the arguments, and then finally we can just return the result. All right, so let's actually try that, see if we made any errors. Okay, events is not defined, line 17. Let's see here. Probably wrote event where events needs to be or something. Let's just make sure this is all correct. Events is not defined. Oh, that's actually line 8. This event. Oh, this should be event. Okay. My events is not defined, line 13. This event. Okay. And so you can see this actually works. But yeah, so it's a pretty straightforward problem once you realize that with closures, you just have access to pretty much everything you need in this object. Like once you realize that, it's really straightforward. If you didn't, you'd probably have to make a variable that had the location of this. I think you could do something like, you could probably do something like, if you didn't have access to it, you could do something like constant, location equals this. I think that would work, and then you would just, make a location here or something. And you could say like location, essentially. I think this would do kind of a similar situation. But because we have access to it directly, we don't actually need to do that, right? We have access to event, we have access to the callback, and we have access to this. And if we were to write anything else in here, we would also have access to it in here. But keep in mind that if you have something like this, equals 5, and you modify this number, then this number would be different for every single, and I also don't think it would be, because this way, I think it would have access to like its own version of the 5, and I don't think it would modify it in the actual event emitter. It would have its own copy of the 5 essentially, and it would just modify the 5. And every object would have its own copy of a 5 that would start with a 5. But because this is an object, it's passed by reference. All right, so that's actually gonna be it for this problem. Hopefully you liked it. And if you did, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.